What's up, gang? Welcome to The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mershazde. I'm so pumped to have you here with me. Now listen, The Greatness Machine, we're about two things. Number one, people who are living their passions. And number two, those who are creating greatness in the world and doing both of these things despite the odds against them. Each episode, we're going to feature interviews with game changers, business leaders, telling us their origin stories, what made them tick, what got them to where they are now. Why? So it can help you step into your greatness within your life, your business, and your career. Occasionally, you might hear a few solo episodes from myself, moi, as I say, as I leverage my 20 years of entrepreneurship as a CEO and founder to help you grow and level up in your journey to scale your life and your business. So come be a fly on the wall, enjoy the conversation, and I'm stoked to have you here with me. Guys, welcome to today's episode of The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mershazde, and boy, do we have a special guest. AJ Jacobs is in the house. What's up, AJ?
Hello, Darius.
Oh, man. Welcome to the show, my friend. I'm so pumped to have you here. How are you doing this morning?
I am good. I'm delighted to be here, talk about greatness and machines and if you want to talk about the article the.
I think we should go every which way and then some.
All right. I'm ready.
So, guys, AJ, I came upon his work. We're going to be talking about his latest book, The Year of Living Constitutionally. And listeners of the show will know that I have strong opinions about a lot of the hypocrisy that we have in the world today around folks that are like, the Constitution says this. And then I'm like, well, what you're doing is not at all constitutional. And so I came upon your work. I think you're on another podcast, and I was like, this is really interesting to like live an entire year as if you were to like one of the founding fathers.
That's it.
Exactly. So I thought that was super cool. Started looking at a lot of your work and was like, oh, this guy's so interesting. I'd love to have you on the show. And we're so grateful to have you here today. If you don't mind, AJ, what I'd love to do is do a quick, kind of go over your formal bio for folks that are maybe not as familiar with your work. And then we love origin stories here at The Greatness Machine. Would love to hear some of your origin story. Like you're a pretty interesting guy. I'm sure you just didn't wake up one day and decide to, walk around with a musket and become one of the founding fathers. But do you mind if I do a quick bio and we'll jump into that? Does that work for you?
I love it. Sounds
great,
like
guys.
A plan.
Perfect. So, you guys, AJ is a New York Times bestselling author, human guinea pig, whose books include Drop Dead Healthy, The Year of Living Biblically, where he actually lived as if like it was like during biblical times, and The Puzzler. He's the host of the podcast, The Puzzler. And latest book that we'll be talking about, as I mentioned earlier, is The Year of Living Constitutionally. But we'd love to start with your origin story. AJ, why don't you tell us a little bit of how did you get to where you got to?
Well, I've always loved... I'm a very curious person. I think that's something we share. You had mentioned your curiosity. I am, it's my favorite human drive, curiosity. And actually, I once interviewed Alex Trebek, the late great. I was working at Esquire magazine, and he had a quote that I sort of live by. And it doesn't make 100% sense, but it makes a lot of sense to me. And he said, I'm curious about everything, even those things that don't interest me, which I think is great because everything could be interesting, even stereotypically boring stuff like accounting. Once you scratch the surface, I'm sure it's fascinating because it's not about numbers. It's about people and passions and businesses. So anyway, I love being curious. I do love writing and reading. That's not true. I hate writing. I like having written, as the saying goes. But I do love the process of researching and having written. And one of my favorite genres has always been people who put themselves in interesting situations.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's called immersive or experiential journalism or method writing, like method acting.
Yeah.
So George Plimpton was a famous guy in the 70s who, just like a regular schmo who joined, he convinced professional baseball and football teams to let him join for a day. So what's it like to be a pro athlete? And another one I liked was Barbara Ehrenreich, Nickel and Dimed, where she took on a series of low-wage jobs to see how crushing those can be. So I was like, I like this genre, and that's how I dived in. And I can tell you the first couple, and it's just blossomed into a series. I've written now about 6 or 7 books where I do everything from living by all the rules of the Bible to explore the Bible, or to thanking 1,000 people who had anything to do with my morning cup of coffee. That was called Thanks 1,000. I tried to be the healthiest person alive. I tried to live by the Constitution to see what our founding fathers really meant when they wrote that Constitution. So it's been a wild journey, and I feel lucky that I can make a living like this.
That's amazing. So let's kind of like start with like the book that really I think like did it was the Year of Living Biblically. Was that your first like big one where you like did something that was audacious? I mean, I think you'd done one before that, right? The Drop Dead Healthy, is that correct?
I did one called The Know-It-All, which was a New York Times bestseller. So that did kind of put me on the map. That one was about, I read the encyclopedia from A to Z.
That's right.
And trying to learn everything in the world. And that was wild. But yeah, the Bible one was even more of a splash. And that one came about because I grew up with no religion at all, very secular. I say in the book, I'm Jewish, but I'm Jewish in the same way the Olive Garden is Italian. But thank you. I wanted to explore religion for two reasons. One, I wanted to know what, if anything, I was missing by having no religion in my life. And I had a son. What should I teach him about religion and the Bible? And the second reason is kind of related to something that you were saying about hypocrisy, because I saw all these fundamentalists who said that they were following the Bible to the letter. They were following it literally. And that's why homosexuality is a sin. That's why they can't abide. And I said, really? Are they really following it? I mean, they're following some of it. But what if I followed everything in the Bible, New and Old Testament? So that meant the 10 Commandments, of course, and love your neighbor. But it also meant you cannot shave the corners of your beard. I don't know where the corners are, so I just let the whole thing grow, and I looked like Gandalf. It says to stone adulterers many times in the Hebrew Scriptures, so I tossed some pebbles at adulterers. That's how I checked that off my list.
Wait, how did you know they was these like publicly known adulterers? It's like you were throwing pebbles at like Trump or something?
Well, that's a good point. Quickly, what happened was I was really getting into it because I like to commit. And I was wearing my robe and sandals, and I had my beard. And I was in Central Park in New York where I lived. And this guy came up to me. He says, "What's going on? Why are you dressed like that?" And I said, "I'm trying to follow everything in the Bible from the 10 Commandments to stoning adulterers." He says, "I'm an adulterer. Are you going to stone me?" And I said, "That'd be awesome. What a nice offer." And so I took out my stones because I had been carrying around stones in my robe pocket for a long time. And I showed them to him. And they were small, as I said, pebble size. But he was very aggressive. He was an aggressive adulterer. He grabbed the stones out of my hand and threw them at my face.
Oh.
So, yeah, thank you. So I thought, an eye for an eye, then I can throw one back at him. So that's how I checked it off. But, I mean, what was interesting was the project went from the ridiculous like that to what I found the sublime or profound, and actually having some life-changing experiences about gratitude and forgiveness and the power of ritual. So I think all of my books, I do try to go from the ridiculous to the sublime, try to cover all of human experience that way.
So in that, I love that story, by the way. But did you? So you do a year, and so it's like, okay, do you start on January 1st and go to the last day of the year? How do you like pick the timing of that?
This time I went I just picked a random day, partly because January 1st is not in the Bible. That's the Roman calendar,
right?
So I felt I was safe. And I spent a long time reading the Bible, and I had a God squad of rabbis and priests and ministers and scholars and atheists. So I had to consult them and make my list of rules before I did it. And so as soon as I was done with that, I dove in.
How long did you plan? How much planning did it take before you launched this thing?
Oh, a long time, probably like 4 or 5 months, just because it's such a huge topic, and which I love. It's a double-edged sword. I take on the biggest topics I can find, the Bible, the Constitution, health, and it's a double-edged sword in that there's never any lack of material, but at the same time, they're so daunting that I feel I have to get this board of experts to help me through, which I love. I mean, I love the fact that people are generous enough to help me. And I still, at least for my first book, I don't know why they did, but I guess now, they know that some people will read it. So, but that's my favorite part is researching, talking to fascinating people, living it, doing crazy, bizarre experiences. And then, as we mentioned, the writing itself, sitting alone in a room, horrible. Just a really unpleasant experience. But I get through it.
Yeah, clearly. So going back to living biblically, like growing up, I myself grew up non-secular. Like my father was from Iran, and so he was brought up Muslim. And my mother grew up in like Western Pennsylvania in a steel mill town, and she was brought up Catholic. And so I have two parents who both hated religion because of how their heritage around it. Right. My dad hated it because he was a business guy, and we were living in Iran when the mullahs basically took over.
Oh wow!
Took over the country.
You were there too.
So I was born in California. I have a twin brother. And my mom got pregnant with us. We were living there. My mom's American, right? And my dad, they met when my dad was in grad school in California. My dad moved back to Iran because that's like where his life was. And my mom followed him, and she was much younger than him. Gets pregnant with twins, and she was having complications. So she came back to the States because like the technology, medicine was better here. Have me and my brother were premature, and then we lived here for a year until June of 1979. Then we moved back to Tehran. So I'm born in America, moved back there. I'm 1 year old in June of 79. November of 79, they take hostages like right down the street from where we live.
Oh my goodness.
And my mom and dad fled Iran to come to the United States. So my dad was already he wasn't, I don't believe he was religious at all before this.
Right.
And it made him extra not religious, because he was like, man, essentially these fundamentalists took over his country and took his life away from him.
Yeah.
So I had a guy that was like always talking shit on the mullahs. And then my mom grew up just in an environment where it was very like guilt ridden, and you got to go, and her parents were not very religious, but she had to go to church and they didn't. So she was like, oh man, this is like, she's a smart lady. She's, my mom's got her master's, and she's like, there's a lot of hypocrisy here. Right.
Totally.
So she was anti-religion. So I grew up in a family super anti-religious. And so it's fascinating to me, like being an outsider, always having friends try to convince me to go to church, and I was always like, kind of like, well, it's just like doesn't make sense to me, right? And because I would see stuff like, I'll give an example. You kind of used the example earlier around the church's position, or at least the perceived position around homosexuality, and I was like, why would God care?
I agree.
I was just like, that just doesn't. I said that just doesn't make sense. And I knew some kids, like, I grew up I went to high school in the 90s. I'm a little bit younger than you are, and so that was right around the turning point where like it was becoming much more like accepted mainstream. So I was in my high school, there was kids that came out, and I'm like, I know these kids, and I'm like, they're not choosing. This is not a choice. Like, this is who they are as humans, right? And so I was like. And I knew my grandmother passed away when I was in high school. Like, and I was very, very close with her, and she died of pancreatic cancer when I was 14. And so watching a grandparent who I deeply cared about die, and so I was like, I knew what she believed. I'm like, well, I know my grandmother didn't believe that this was a bad thing. So what you're telling me is my grandmother's in hell because she doesn't believe this thing that I actually don't believe either. And I said, this doesn't seem real to me. So I became even like, I thought that was very hypocritical.
Sure.
So anyway, I just bring that up in that, like, having lived in that, a year of your life doing that, what was like, what did, I mean, I still believe there's a lot of hypocrisy in many of the more extreme religions, like extreme positions on religions. And the other thing that I believe is that, like, when I read a book called, oh gosh, oh shoot, I'm forgetting it. But anyway, I'll remember it. It was, oh man, I'm killing myself right now. I hate when I forget names. Anyway, it was about Jesus Christ and how he was essentially anti-Roman, which is why he was crucified, right?
Mm.
And so Zealot. It's called Zealot. It's this real.
Interesting.
I don't know if you read that book or not,
Nope.
but you know, one of the perspectives was like, these are all stories that were told hundreds of years after his death. Not, the only writing you have of it's on the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? And so, like, so it's all interpretation. So
Sure.
having lived a life where you were basically basing it off of an interpretation, like, it gives so much, I guess, wiggle room to interpret it yourself. How did you do that?
Well, first of all, I think we agree fundamentalism is a huge scourge on humanity. I just hate it in all of its forms. I'm fundamentalist about my hatred of fundamentalism.
Yeah, me too.
And that was part of the book, that these people say, yeah, the Bible says this, therefore the world was created 5,000 years ago. It's in the Bible. So part of the book's point was, don't be a fundamentalist. And what I think is interesting is, I think it's possible to divide the world between religious and non-religious, but it's also possible to divide the world between fundamentalists and non-fundamentalists, because there are secular fundamentalists. There's, people who are rabid Marxists or rabid free market fundamentalists or identitarian fundamentalists. And so I think anyone who is so committed to one ideology is dangerous. You have to look at the world through many different lenses and keep a flexible mind. So for me, religion is a tool, and it can be very, very bad for all the reasons you were saying. On the other hand, if it's used properly, in my opinion, it can be a force for good. And for instance, just having a community, like, there's a lot of studies that people who go to church live longer and are healthier. And I don't think that's because God hates non-churchgoers and smites them. I think it's because the science says they have a tight-knit community. So it doesn't have to be church. It could be a secular community. It could be I like secular religions, even, where people just meet on a weekend to talk about ethics and have rituals. And rituals can be very fulfilling, I think, whether secular or not. So I think that, to me, is the key. Taking some good elements of religion, and whether you believe in God or not, I don't think that matters. It's more the rituals, the behavior, the ethical behavior, the community. And as for interpretation, like you said, that there's a quote I use in the book, both the Bible book and the Constitution book, and I'm trying to remember which poet said it. I think it was Yeats. He wrote, "We both read the Bible day and night. You read black and I read white." So, like you said, you can interpret it. It's vague enough that people used the Bible to justify slavery. Oh, it's the mark of Cain. This is God wanted slavery. And then, of course, thankfully, the abolition movement used the Bible to say, no, we're all God's children. You cannot have slavery. And religion was a huge force behind the emancipation. So I guess that was one of the big takeaways. It's a tool. It can be a tool for good, or it can be a tool for bad. A last point on this is, there's the phrase cherry picking. So fundamentalists might say, oh, you're just cherry picking from the Bible the parts about accepting outcasts, and you're not focusing on the parts about how men cannot sleep with other men. And my response is, well, cherry picking, what is wrong with cherry picking? Cherry picking can be great. I mean, if you choose the right cherries, the cherries that are meaningful and good about loving your neighbor, and leave that rotten cherries on the vine. Leave the ones about, hating homosexuals. Leave those on the vine. We don't want those. We have moved on from that.
Yeah, I love that, man. It's such an interesting, like, just a way to approach. Like, I love the fact that you use the term method, right? Like to go in and immerse yourself, and yeah, like from my perspective, is I'm a big God person, so I'm just not religious, and so it's just, I think it's fascinating that you chose that process, and I agree. It's like, what's wrong with cherry picking? Because I think I've never heard someone say that before, but I'm like, oh, I mean, like, I think that there's an honesty around it that's the only time is when people cherry pick and ignore data that doesn't support their argument, right?
Right, sure.
Right, which I think is,
motivated reasoning and the confirmation bias are huge.
Right. Yeah, and I'm like, that's just not intellectually honest. You're being intellectually dishonest, because you're ignoring what you want to ignore that doesn't suit your argument. But so going back to the process of doing this, like, what was your biggest takeaway after immersing yourself for a year? Was it something where did you actually like talking about method? There's one part to method do. There's another part to method be, where you're like, I am of biblical times and spoke like biblically, or were you just like doing, but you were yourself doing?
Well, I was doing and being as much as I could. So as I said, I had the beard, I had the robe, I had, it affected everything, the way I talked, the way I ate, the way I couldn't gossip or lie or covet, which is, I live in New York City and my day job at the time was a journalist. So that's like 70% of my day. I couldn't say, the Bible says you can't even say the names of pagan gods. You can't worship them, but don't even utter them. That is an abomination. So what do I do about the days of the week? Those are all Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Months?
So, yeah, right? Months, planets, Venus Williams. I had to call her, that Williams sister, and, the first day of the week. It's ridiculous. So which was part of the point. Like, people who say they are following the Bible literally are cherry picking. So I said, I am not going to. I'm just going to show you what it's like to be the ultimate fundamentalist. And it was bizarre. And I couldn't touch my wife. In the Old Testament, there's a lot of laws about purity. So when women are menstruating, you can't touch them. And more than that, in Leviticus, it says, if a woman sits on a seat while she's menstruating, the seat becomes impure. And my wife found that offensive. So she sat in every seat in our apartment while she was menstruating. So I had to stand for most of the year.
What? So at the end of the year, what was your biggest takeaway?
Well, I think there were two types of takeaways. One was what we were just talking about. Fundamentalism, very bad. Do not be a fundamentalist. On the other hand, you can take the Bible seriously and be inspired by it. Just don't take it literally. Take it seriously, but not literally. And things like gratitude was a nice theme that during my year, because the Bible does say be grateful for everything. So I was trying to do that. I would press the elevator button and be grateful the elevator came. I'd get in the elevator and be grateful it didn't plummet to the basement and break my collarbone. And this mindset is lovely because it's a good way to battle the negative bias where we're so good at noticing those 3 or 4 things that go wrong. And that actually inspired one of my later books, which was called Thanks 1,000, that I mentioned briefly, about thanking 1,000 people who had anything to do with my morning cup of coffee. That was sort of a biblical gratitude project. Where I thanked the barista, but I also thanked the farmer in South America. I flew to Colombia, and I thanked the truck driver who drove the beans and the guy who made the road so the truck driver could drive it. So I kind of went crazy, out of control, but in a good way, out of control in a good way.
So when you're doing these immersive projects, what happens to your home life? Is your wife like, oh no, here he goes again, and you're just off for that year, or is it just like you do it 9 to 5 and then you're obviously you're still immersive and that you're dressed a certain way. But I mean, I guess you can't turn it off. You're like doing it.
No, if I'm committed. And yes, well, it is. You can ask her, but I think she'll say it's a very mixed experience. On the one hand, it can drive her crazy, like the menstruation laws. She didn't love that. In the Constitution, if you really go by 1800s thinking and laws, it's not the most enlightened feminist time back then. So, I try to instill that women couldn't sign contracts. That was perfectly constitutional to prevent women. And she runs a business where she signs contracts all the time. And I was like, well, maybe I should take over and do. And at first she was like, sure, I don't like red tape. But then I was so bad at it, she fired me. So that did not last more than a couple hours. So sometimes she hates it. Other times I do think I come out, part of the goal is to come out a better person. I go through these bizarre processes, but I have the takeaways like gratitude, like, finding meaning in rituals, and hopefully I'm a little bit of a better person. And sometimes there are adventures she likes to go on. So with the Bible, we hung out. We stayed in an Amish guy's house, which was fascinating. So heard a couple of Amish jokes from an Amish guy with this colonial one, the Constitution one. I joined a Revolutionary War reenactment group, and she loves history, so she kind of got into it and put on her corset and went out there with me into the battlefield. So it's a mixed blessing.
That's amazing. So let's talk about the latest project, the Year of Living Constitutionally. Look, we're in an election year. I probably have found myself saying at least 24 times our founding fathers would be rolling in their graves if they heard what our politicians are saying or how they're using like the work that was done to build this democracy and then weaponizing it against each other. Tell us a little bit about this project. Like how long ago did you do it? Like again, I know you give us some color on it, but I'd love to get some background on that and what that was like.
Of course. This one was kind of a sequel to the Bible one because it deals with the very same issues. How should we interpret this text? How literally should we take it? So part of it was, again, an argument against fundamentalism and originalism, which is the idea that we should try to figure out what the most important thing when looking at the Constitution is, what did the founding fathers think when they wrote it? What was it? What was the public meaning back then? So part of it was a critique of that fundamentalism, and part of it was, well, what should we do to save America and save democracy? Because we are in this massive crisis. So to explore it, I said, I'm going to become the ultimate originalist and try to get inside the minds of the founding fathers, and using the technology and mindset of the founders, try to live a year. So that meant with my Second Amendment rights, they didn't have modern guns. So I bore my musket. I bought a musket off of ye old internet and carried it around New York City as my Second Amendment right. And the First Amendment was written in a time of pamphlets and quill pens, not Twitter or Snapchat. So I wrote much of the book, and I wrote all these letters with my quill. The Constitution talks about quartering soldiers. About keeping soldiers in your house. So I did quarter a soldier and then ask him to leave, as is my Third Amendment right. So it was wild, and it was a crash course in the Constitution. Again, I had all of these great legal minds advising me, and it was part ridiculous, but also part quite serious. What should we do about the Constitution? How should we interpret it? And how can we best keep our country functional, which seems to be a harder and harder task.
So in spending the time doing that, obviously there's parts of this that, to your point, are ridiculous and contextually don't work in today's society or are not relevant, right?
Yeah.
Or as relevant, and then there's parts where they're foundational to the democracy we have. When you start looking at the parts that are maybe less of the, taking something that was relevant, 300 plus years ago or 200 plus years ago, and looking at the stuff that is relevant today. What was your observation around how people are actually misusing the Constitution right now in today's times? Because I'll say that because I realized I read the Constitution about a month ago.
Oh, interesting.
And it was something that I was like, oh, I don't think I've read this since like high school. Right. And then I had a realization. I'm like, I actually think most people in the United States have never read the Constitution.
In fact, there is statistics. 60% of Americans have not read it. And I would say that's way low. I'm sure it's I had not read it. So that was part of the motivation. And yeah, I would say, well, first of all, I do want to say there were positive parts. It wasn't all a critique. It was like, how can we use the Constitution in a positive way? So I do want to mention that. And if we have time, just get to that. But in terms of your question, how are people misusing and misinterpreting the Constitution? I think absolutely there is a lot of it. There are two questions when it comes to originalism. And part of this was motivated by the rise of originalism, because as you might know, 5 of the 9 Supreme Court justices identify as originalists, and they're the conservative ones. And that has a huge effect on how they make decisions. It's how they see the world. So it's how, whether it's about women's health or guns or religion or where we go to school, it has a massive effect on our life. So when it comes to originalism, I had 2 questions. One, is it the best way to approach the Constitution, to focus on that original meaning? Or is the other approach, which is sometimes called living constitutionalism or pragmatism? And these are people who say, no, the meaning kind of evolves. You have to look not just at the past, but at the present and how it's going to affect the future. And the 14th Amendment, when they wrote that in the 1860s about equal protection, they weren't thinking of gay marriage, but now we are. So now we can evolve the meaning. So those are the 2 oversimplified sides. So the first question is originalism the best way, or should we have a more living constitutionalist approach? And if originalism is the best way, are the Supreme Court justices correctly interpreting the original content and meaning? And I would argue no to both of those, but it is fast, like you said, there is a lot of misinterpretation because they had a very different point of view in the founding. And I'll just give you one example, which was this concept of rights. Today, society, we are very individual rights focused, which I think is great. We need individual rights. But back then, they were not as obsessed with individual rights, or at least they balanced those individual rights with responsibilities, civic duty, whether it was being on the bucket brigade and putting out fires or being part of a militia. You had individual rights, but they believed, all the founding fathers, this is natural law theory, they believed once you enter a society, then your rights are constrained by what's good for the society. And one quick example of that is the First Amendment. I happen to love the First Amendment, the free speech, but I love the 21st century version. I don't love the original version. The original version was much more constrained. The original version, they believed you could publish whatever you wanted, a pamphlet or a book. You didn't need prior approval from the king or the president. But once it was out there, if it was damaging to the infant democracy, then you could be punished. There were laws, in state laws, especially in the 1790s and early 1800s, blasphemy laws. You couldn't say damn, or you would get fined. In New York, it was 37.5 cents. You couldn't curse. You couldn't say the F word. Another 37.5 cents. There was sedition. They were much, much stricter about sedition. So, neither side, conservatives or progressives, would want to go back to that First Amendment. Progressives would hate how you can't basically curse or criticize government. And conservatives, the founders would not have thought that unlimited donations to from corporations to political candidates, that would not be covered by the First Amendment. And that is a big part of the conservative view of the First Amendment, the whole citizens united and corporate donations. So neither side wants that. So the big picture is, I do think originalism is not the best way to interpret it. And secondly, if you are doing originalism, if you were doing it properly, we would live in a crazy society that no one would want.
Yeah, and that I guess that's like the part that gets me is this is something written, a couple hundred years ago. Like some of the the bones of it make sense, but like the body is probably a little bit different because the world's different, right? And you can't just say, like, if you're going to be, to your point, you can't cherry pick what suits what you like and ignore the stuff you don't like. You either accept it for all that it is, or you accept the fact that it's a nuanced document and the bones are relevant, but like we have to adjust as life changes to the way culture changes, because culture defines society, right? Like that's really, like, outside of the rules, like your culture is what like kind of shapes society, and there's no question culture is different, and and culture is going to continue to be different because it's an organism that changes. So when you look back at this experience of doing that and start thinking about the good, and how that's being used today, what's your observation around the good and how that's being used?
Well, I like your analogy of the bones are the same. You can also say, sort of on a higher level, the principles, things like equal protection under the law, liberty, the blessings of the liberty, the general welfare, which is mentioned in the preamble, and that doesn't get enough attention. So that, I agree, is a better way to approach it. And I'll just give you sort of a specific example of two ways to approach it. One is, and this was right before the Civil War. So you had two very famous abolitionists. You had William Lloyd Garrison, who was a white man, and he said the Constitution is a pact with the devil. It is an evil document. And he burned it. He would take a copy and burn it on stage in front of hundreds of people. So he was a showman. There was Frederick Douglass, also an abolitionist. Originally, he agreed with William Lloyd Garrison. It was a pact with the devil. And it was a pact with the devil because it condoned slavery. It says in there, there's nothing where that says slave. And it was an elitist slaveocracy document. That was Garrison's point of view. Originally, Frederick Douglass said, yeah, I agree. But somewhere in the 1850s, he changed his mind. And he said, actually, that's not a very effective or productive way to look at it. Let's look at, instead, the Constitution as a promissory note, an IOU. It has these ideas of liberty and equality, and yet we have massive inequality. We have slavery and all these other problems. So he said, let's try to hold America accountable to live up to the ideals that are in the Constitution. The seeds of the problems are in the Constitution itself. And this idea of a promissory note, an IOU, was very powerful. And Martin Luther King used the same language. Obama, when he gave a famous speech on race, talked about the same idea. And I find that a more productive frame when looking at the Constitution. Let's make it live up to its ideals, the bones, as you call it, or the high principles, and not focus as much on the little details that might have been written, that were written 238 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I wrote a book called The Core Value Equation, which is how do you build core value driven organizations. I'm an entrepreneur, and I obsessed about this because I'm like, look, your values dictate your behaviors, right? And your behaviors dictate the results that kind of happen, right?
Yeah.
And so it's interesting, as you were saying that right now, I just started thinking about values, and in my world of designing organizations, there's really two types of values. There's values that you're going to be stringent about. That's like, hey, this is like, if you do this, it's like you get put to death, aka you can't be here, right? And then there's aspirational values, right? Which is hey, we know it's going to be hard to do this, but we're going to fight to try to make it true. And we're going to probably fall short, but we know that it's a work in progress, and we're going to always just like strive for that, knowing that it'll be rare that we get it, and we'll probably fall off of it, and then we're going to fight to make it be true again. So is that how you're kind of seeing this? That these are like aspirational principles, some of them, not all of them, but some of them, and we have to fight to make them be true as much as we can, knowing that we're going to probably fall short. Is that
Absolutely. I mean, that's the phrase in the preamble, a more perfect nation, which is, I ran the Constitution through Grammarly, and it did not like the phrase "more perfect." But what they were saying is, we'll never be perfect, but we can strive. We can try to force that arc of justice to get closer and closer to true justice. And I believe that to be true in everything. I mean, I see morality as, it's not an on-off. You're not either sinning or not sinning. It's not an on-off switch. It's a dimmer. So you can act in a more moral way, and you can always strive to get lighter and lighter. I mean, if it were an on-off switch, you could argue that we are sinning all the time, because right now I could donate $5,000 and literally save a life in a developing country, and the fact that I'm not is a sin of omission, and it's just not from one point of view it is as bad as killing someone, because I have the ability to save a life and I am not doing it. But that's a very difficult mindset, and if you think that way, you're going to go insane and curl up in a fetal position. So instead, see it as a dimmer. I'm always working. I'll never be perfect. I'm not going to give away 98% of my money, but I'm always going to strive to be better and make better decisions. Not the best decision, but better decisions.
I love that. So when you, after having spent a year living constitutionally with the upcoming election, what's like if you were to give one nugget of thought that a listener might think about as they're going out to vote, like what would be that nugget of thought?
I love that question. One of the big themes, the part of the big thesis of the book, like with the Bible, is there are a lot of parts of the 1700s that were terrible. It was racist, sexist, it was dangerous, it was smelly. Cutting edge medicine was the tobacco enema, where they would literally take a tube and blow smoke up your ass, because that was thought to cure diseases. So lots that we don't want to go back to, but there are elements that we do. And one is what we talked about, the idea of virtue and community, thinking about others. Another is, I do believe the founders had more epistemic humility than we do. They were more open-minded and flexible and not as intransigent. And you can see that when you look at the Constitutional Convention, all the wild ideas that were being thrown around. The fact that we have a single president, that could have gone the other way. There were lots of the delegates wanted 3 or 12 presidents. They said, why do we want a single president? We just fought a war to get rid of a king. So keeping an open mind, and I'll just give you my favorite founding father, Ben Franklin. During the Constitutional Convention, he made a speech, which is my favorite speech at the convention. He said, first of all, the older I get, the less certain I am of my own opinions. And second, he told a parable, like a jest. He's a little bit of a jester. And he said, there was this French lady, and she said to her sister, it's so strange. Why is it I'm the only person I've ever met who is correct on every single issue? And his point was, it holds up after 200 years. His point was, we're all the French lady. We all think we're correct. It's that idea of confirmation bias that we were talking about. And he was saying, be aware of your own biases. He was like Daniel Kahneman 200 years ago. Be aware of your own biases and try to look at things from several points of view. Don't be intransigent. Don't be so tribal that you support everything that your party does, because that is just not a way forward. That's just going to continue to divide America.
I love that. It's Good old Ben Franklin.
Love him. Love him. And he also, I mean, in his autobiography, and I love this when I'm talking to someone who's has a very different point of view, he said, never say words like undoubtedly or absolutely. He said, it seems, use language like it seems to me, or I could be wrong, but, and that is much more likely to have a productive conversation.
I love that. This is a random question. I was when I was reading through your bio, I saw that you donate was it 10% of your income? Is that correct?
That is true. I do donate it to charities that are sort of proven to be effective. Like Give Well is a very good organization that figures out what is the best. And I'm a fan of this guy Will MacAskill, who I don't know if you had him on the show, but he's a philosopher at Oxford, and he was one of the founders of the effective altruism movement.
Yep, I'm familiar with him.
And I think that their idea is great. I think I'm very angry at Sam Bankman-Fried because he tarnished the brand, and I hope that it can recover from that jerk. But the idea I find hard to argue with, which is we should think about how best to do good. Think in, very systematically and rationally, how can we make the world a better place? And don't just follow our gut, because our gut can mislead you. Our gut can be, oh, there's a baby girl down the well. Yes, that is terrible. But there are also, 1 million people dying of X disease that can be solved. So let's look at the big picture. Sure, save baby Jessica, but let's not have CNN focus on baby Jessica for, 2 hours straight.
Yeah. So you said you got to my punch. I was going to ask you if you were an effective altruist. So it sounds like you are. Is that correct?
I mean, I just wrote a piece for my Substack, which is called Experimental Living with AJ Jacobs, about how I try not to use nouns when talking about people, because I think it makes it harder to change. So I wouldn't say I'm an effective altruist, but I would say I like a lot of the ideas of effective altruism. Just like I would never say I am a Jew, I would say there are some ideas in Judaism that I find interesting and productive.
Yeah, no, that I will. So I know you were dogging on SBF a second ago. I'll give a little quip, and then I know we're getting towards the end of the show here. I read Mike, what's his face, the guy that wrote Going Infinite, which is Michael Lewis's book about Sam Bankman-Fried. Which have you read that book?
I haven't, because I felt I would get too annoyed and upset, but I do want to. Yeah. So what would you find?
I'm a Michael Lewis fan. Like I like a lot of his books. It was entertaining and you kind of realize that the guy, I think, was like, I actually don't think he realized he was doing something like that was that nefarious. That's actually my takeaway was, I actually don't think he thought he was doing that. I think he's just like kind of like on the spectrum, and there was like a donut hole in his brain for that, right?
Yeah.
But the gift I got from the book was it turned me on to effective altruism. So I hadn't heard of it before, and then I ended up reading The Most Good You Can Do by David Singer. Peter David Singer. So I got that book out of it. So it was, anyway, when I read that about you and I saw that you were donating to malaria, like the malaria foundations, I was like, oh, I wonder if he's an effective, if you subscribe to this philosophy. So it was more of a curiosity question.
No, I love talking about it, and I do. Yeah, I mean, I still think the ideas are very strong. Will MacAskill is super thoughtful. He's the opposite of a fundamentalist, because it's all about questioning your own beliefs and not being. And Sam Bankman-Fried did a lot of damage to it. He also, I think, fell victim to the fallacy of the ends justify the means.
Right.
And sometimes they do, but often they do not, partly because then you lose sight of what you're doing, and that is such a dangerous mindset that it can be used for, I'm sure Hitler thought the ends justified the
I'm
means.
sure.
All these horrible people thought. So, he just, I think, distorted the message of effective altruism, which to me is still very strong. Think carefully about combine the heart and the brain, compassion and rationality, and you can be better than if you're just purely rational or just purely compassionate.
Well, it kind of goes with this whole theme of thinking biblically or thinking constitutionally, which is there's nuance in all these things, and being fundamental in either way. Like I'm a centrist when it comes to like my political beliefs, and it drives my family crazy. That's much more liberal, because it drives some of my more right wing friends crazy, because I'm like, well, I understand why you both think what you think, right?
Yeah.
Like I get it. I don't necessarily agree with either of the positions, but it goes even if we're talking about giving, right? Like heart and mind. There's like we are complex organisms, and there's a reason we have a heart and a mind, because you have to use both, right? So I appreciate that.
Well,
thought.
I love that too. And the other thing is, like, I think it's bad that we have this this idea that there's a line of liberal to conservative as if it's just one axis. I feel there's so many axes out there depending on what the belief is. So I'm a centrist in many ways, but I'm radical in my thoughts about factory farming, for instance. And so the fact that we have these two areas that are clumped together, and conservatives, for instance, think if you're conservative, you have to be anti-abortion and pro-guns, and those don't go together. Those have nothing to do with each other. So don't just buy into everything that your tribe thinks. Think about every idea individually and come to its own conclusion.
Well, the funny thing there, I know we're out of time, but the funny thing there is like using the conservative statement is, conservatives were the original conservationists.
That's so true, right?
But many of them are anti, like, essentially like fighting the downfall of global warming, or global climate change, because it's because of these tribalisms. And I'm like, you're the original conservationists. Like, what you're saying doesn't make sense, right?
Such a good point. And by the way, I recommend this documentary on the ozone layer. It has ozone, but it was all about how Ronald Reagan was the force behind the Montreal Protocol, which saved us from the ozone layer and an environmental disaster. And he loved nature. He loved his ranch. So the fact that it's a conservative versus liberal is it makes no sense rationally.
Yeah. Pesky, gosh dang it, AJ, pesky history and facts. Like, you can't use that when they defeat your argument, you can't use them anymore, because that would be a complete and utter abomination. Come on.
Exactly.
Man.
That's what we, unfortunately, people do not believe that. They just,
my brain explodes. I'm like, you realize how intellectually dishonest what you're saying is. I'm like just know that the facts and the history of that you're making argument out of are actually at odds with what you're saying.
Yeah,
so
totally.
It drives me nuts. Well, look, man, I'm so grateful to have you on the show today. I'd love to, you're working on tons of stuff. Where can people get more of your stuff? Where can they, you have a podcast, so we didn't even get to talk about the Puzzler. What are you working on that you want to share? And then I'd love to get to the greatness question.
Yeah. First, I mentioned my Substack. I'm very excited about it. It's a free weekly newsletter where I have an essay called Experimental Living with AJ Jacobs. As you mentioned, I have the podcast, which is a daily iHeart podcast called The Puzzler, where I give audio-friendly puzzles. If you like Wordle and Spelling Bee, that's something to check out. And my new book is The Year of Living Constitutionally.
Awesome. Well, AJ, thank you so much for coming on the show. I want to go to the greatness question, and then we'll get you out of here. So you ready for the greatness question, my friend?
Yes, I absolutely am.
All right. What is the number one barrier to creating greatness that you've overcome in your life, and how have you overcome it?
Well, first of all, I don't know if I have overcome it, but I've made some progress. So again, it's not a binary, but I'm getting better. It's the more perfect. And that would just be about rejection. I mean, I am, as a writer, I get rejected even though I'm pretty established and have had several New York Times bestsellers. I still get rejected all the time. And I guess one of the strategies I use is the whole fake it till you feel it, the whole exterior affects the interior. So acting like I'm confident, or acting like I'm grateful, or acting like I'm positive and happy, even if I'm not feeling it. And eventually the mind will catch up with the behavior. So that's part of cognitive behavioral psychology, for instance. So yeah, if I'm feeling, no one cares, let me just pretend like I've got this great idea. Let me share it. And or gratitude. When I tried to thank 1,000 people, I'd wake up cranky and be like, I don't want to do this. But I'd force myself to do it. And the acting as if eventually can be very powerful. So act as if rejection doesn't dissuade you, and eventually you will become a little more immune, if not totally immune, to rejection.
I love that. AJ, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Appreciate you so much. I'm so excited for all the work you're doing and continue to do. And yeah, it's been a great time having you on the show today.
My pleasure. I loved it. And thank you for your thought-provoking questions.
Oh, my pleasure. Guys, go out there, get the books, check out the podcasts, and then some. And subscribe to the Substack. Until next time, peace out, everybody. We love you. You are listening to The Greatness Machine, and that's a wrap for today. Listen, if you love what you heard, subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform that you're tuning in on so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. We have tons of great people coming on, and we're stoked to have you here to enjoy it with us. Leave us a review. Tell us what you love most about this particular episode. We love getting the reviews. We love to see what you guys love most. And if this particular episode, made you think of someone who's leveling up in their business and in their life, print screen, share it with them. Leaders are the best givers. And after all, we're all here to support and grow with each other. And in case you want to see some of the fun behind the scenes shots or some of the things that we're doing, I'm actually writing about this in my weekly newsletter. Go to www.therealdarius.com and subscribe to my newsletter. We're talking about fun things like business and life and mindfulness and cryptocurrencies and gosh, I don't even know, everything and anything, but it's tons of fun stuff I write about. I try to get it out on a weekly basis. You can subscribe at www.therealdarius.com. And with that said, look, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. I love you. Peace. We're out of here. See you guys on the next one.
She's my lover.